Well, have you heard of the butterfly effect? You probably have. Butterfly effect was first studied in relation to meteorology. It's basically this idea that, a butterfly flaps its wings in Rio de Janeiro, and the next thing you know, that affects, the flapping of a butterfly's wings affects the weather patterns in Chicago and the tornadoes there. It's a part of chaos theory, and people apply it to lots of different things. But as we've been studying the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, one of the things that I want you to understand that the author is trying to get us to see is that sin has a butterfly effect. We have been looking at the stories leading up to Absalom's life. And to understand those stories, Absalom's life, we have to go back. In chapter 11, David fails royally, pun intended. He is the king, and he sins. In chapter 12, a prophet comes to him on behalf of God and says, David, you can be forgiven, but the consequences of your sin are going to haunt your family for generations to come. And then chapter 13, we see the beginnings of that. One of David's sons, Amnon, rapes one of David's daughters, Tamar. And then a man named Absolum kills his brother. It's as if the author is saying, look, sin spills out. It spills out from the palace through generations. But here's the thing you need to understand. That chapter 13, it doesn't begin with Tamar's name in the Hebrew, and it doesn't end with Tamar's name in the Hebrew. It begins with Absalom's name, and it ends with Absalom's name. Why? Because what the author is trying to show us is that the events of chapter 13 are going to be determinative for Absalom's life. But the events of chapter 13 flow directly from David's sin. So that means that the tragic story of Absalom's life is a continuation of the tragic story of David's sin. It's a butterfly effect. So today we look at the story of Absalom. His name, as was mentioned earlier, is a combination of peace and father. But he did not bring his father peace, nor did his father bring him peace. No, because David refused to protect his daughter Tamar, because he refused to judge Amnon, Absalom avenges his sister by killing his brother. He is forced to flee. That's where we left off last week. And when we pick up in chapter 14, Absalom has been in exile in Geshem for 3 years. 3 years he's heard nothing from his father. 3 years he's been away from his home, though his father did long to see him. Chapter 14, verse 1, we read that David's heart longed for Absalom, but he had no idea. Now that's tragic. I mean, could you imagine being a son and just wanting to know, did your daddy love you? Did he accept you? What did he think about you? I'm sure Absalom was feeling that way. But for 3 years, he did not. He heard nothing because David did not know how to reach out to him. It's tragic. Maybe some of you feel that right now in a relationship. Or you have. You know what it's like to want reconciliation, but you just don't know how to make the first step. You know what it's like to want to receive some reconciliation, and it's on the onus of the other person to reach out, but you're waiting, but you just don't know what to do about it, and you're sitting there, and you have no idea what's happening on the other end of the line. And sometimes it takes a third party to help to help bridge the gap. This time it took Joab. Joab was David's chief commander, and he was his chief of staff. And Joab, he realizes that David longs to see Absalom, so he hatches this plan. He gets this woman to come and approach David, and she comes and she tells this elaborate story in chapter 14. And she says, I had these two sons, and they got into a fight in a field, and there was no one to break them up, and one of them killed the other, and so he ran off. And David's like, this is horrible. And she's like, yes, but I want the son who killed the other one to come back, and I want to know that he's going to be protected. And David's like, he'll be protected. Not a hair on your son's head will be touched. It's like he was already writing the Heidelberg Catechism. Not a hair on your son's head will be touched. And then she looks at him and she goes, David, you're the man. And he's like, got me again. Sneak attack. He got me again. And he goes, did Joab put you up to this? She's like, yeah, Joab put me up to this. I mean, how many times can this happen to a guy? It's the same thing that Nathan did. And it happens again to him. But in the midst of this, she actually says to him, listen, David, chapter 14, verse 14, we must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God will not take away life. And he devises a means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. Do you hear what she's saying? She's saying, David, look, Amnon is dead, and that is tragic, and that is horrible, and you can't bring him back, and you can't undo the past, and I'm sorry about that. But you have a son who is out there, and you can bring him back, and you can do something about that. Because God, he is a reconciling God. God desires to reconcile people to himself. And so he has provided a means for the outcast, for the exile to be brought back home. And David, you can live into that. I don't know who needs to hear this today, but I want you to know that God is a reconciling God, and that he provides a means for the outcast to be reconciled to him and to others. And so we can live into that. And David starts to live into that. In verse 23, he calls for Absalom, and Absalom comes home. And when Absalom enters in the gates of Jerusalem and he enters into the streets of Jerusalem, do you know what he received? Was it a father who ran and hugged him and kissed him on the neck and said, I'm so glad you're home. Kill the fattened calf. Let's have a party. Let's do this thing. You have been gone for 3 years, and now you're back, and I love you, and I'm for you. No, he lived into the reconciling love of God, but not fully. Because verse 55, David says, when Absalom comes back, let him depart in his own house. He is not to come into my presence. And so Absalom, he comes home, but he is not home. He might be back in Jerusalem, but he is not back in. And he feels that, and he knows that. In fact, the text tells us that for 2 more years, verse 27 says, for 2 more years, he is back in that state. See, what happened with Absalom and what happened with David is that there's this force in the world, this power. It's called the law. And it infiltrates relationships, and when it does, it means that our relationships are based on this idea of do this in order to be accepted and acceptable, do this in order to live. And when law gets in a relationship, it makes it toxic. When law gets in a relationship between parents and children, between husbands and wives, and it's like you can't get past it. It's all about do this for me. Or they didn't do this for me, or I did this for them, or am I really in or not, or I feel like I'm on a guilt trip all the time. The only thing that can overcome the power of law in a relationship is the power of grace. an act of grace, of love that's given without regard to worth, where the basis of the relationship is not based on performance. Urban Meyer, the storied coach, you probably know him. He has just taken over the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's had a very successful college career. He's moved from one team to the next, and everywhere he's gone, he's had absolute success, and he's gone to the top. The most recent, Ohio State. Before that, Florida. His dad told him when he was young, failure is not an option, son. Don't reflect, keep moving on. And when he struck out for the first time in baseball, his dad made him run home. He's been running home ever since. A lot of us have been running home ever since. Because we're living in relationships that are based on law. Do you know what happens when an estranged... if you have a hard time reconciling with someone, I guarantee you that somewhere along the way, law infiltrated the relationship and became the basis for it. I guarantee you. Do you know what happens when sons and daughters are home, but they don't feel at home? Do you know what happens when they're home, but they're not sure whether or not they're loved? Well, I tell you what Absalom did. He burned down a field. He lived next door to Joab. Remember Joab, David's chief commander? And he sends Joab a message to get a hearing with his father, but Joab didn't respond. And so one day Absalom sends his servants out and he says, hey, go burn down Joab's field. And then Joab comes and he's like, wait, why'd you burn down my field? And Absalom's like, because you didn't return my messages. That'll get his attention. Some of you are going to come home tonight, and this is golden application, and you're going to be like, why is my house on fire? Check your email. Check your email. That might be why. I'm having a hard time getting people to respond to my emails. It's in the Bible, y'all. It's in the Bible. Seriously. He burned down the man's field, and Joab's like, okay, I hear you now. I got it. And so he goes. He goes, and right there, he gets a hearing. Verse 33 depicts the scene. Absalom has been gone for 5 years, and it says, so Absalom came to the king, and he bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. Not a father, the king. He didn't come before his father, David. He came before the king, as a foreign emissary would before a king. And he bows before the king. And the king gives him the kiss that a king would give to a foreign emissary. You see, this is cold formality. This is not the warm embrace of a father to a prodigal son. That's what law does to relationships. It turns things into cold formality. And Absalom, he's treated like a political dignitary. And so he says, okay, treat me like a political dignitary, I'll act like one. In chapter 15, which we just read, is like a modern day presidential campaign. The first thing that happens in verse 1 is Absalom, he's got a motorcade. And he goes out on this presidential tour. And then he's out there and he is mixing up with the people, verse 5. He's shaking hands. He's giving kisses. He even has a strategy. In verses 2 through 4, he exploits a weakness he's found in his opponent. He's got some dirt on David. See, David has been derelict at his duty in judging Israel. And so when people are coming to the gates and they're like, nobody's taking up my case, Absalom's like, if you elected me, I'd take up your case. And his popularity just starts to rise. It didn't hurt that he was good looking either. One thing that I didn't mention is that back in chapter 14, we find verse 25, now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. For from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. I don't think that there's been anyone this good looking in Israel since, I don't know, Saul. And it says in verse 5 that he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And he didn't just steal the hearts of the men of Israel. He stole the heart of Ahithophel, we find in verse 31. Now, you need to know two things about Ahithophel. First, Ahithophel was David's counselor. It was his best counselor, his best strategist. To steal Ahithophel was like getting Bill Walsh or Phil Jackson. If you don't know who they are, don't worry about it. Ask me later. I mean, to lose Ahithophel, though, was like, that was a huge loss. The other thing that you need to know about Ahithophel is not only was he an amazing strategist, an amazing counselor, he was also Bathsheba's grandfather. Butterfly effect. And so, Ahithophel joins Absalom, and Absalom is planning to take over his father's kingdom. It is a tragic story. At this point, David's life begins to unravel. In verse 14 of chapter 15, he is forced to flee Jerusalem. But this time he is not fleeing from the Canaanites, the Philistines, or even Saul. He's fleeing from his own son who is trying to take the kingdom from him. He is a broken man from this event. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 30, it says that David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot with his head covered. It is a long, slow march out of Jerusalem. He stops at the last house just to grieve and mourn and look and think about how he got to such a low place. And then he begins his descent from the top of Israel on the Mount of Olives to the bottom of Israel. See, this is David's downfall. But it's in that descent that David starts to change. We see that change in two ways. First is in verses 24 and 25. You see, the priests, they'd come following David out of Jerusalem. And you know what they have with them? The Ark of the Covenant. And David says, whoa, wait a second. We've done this before. Go take the Ark of the Covenant and take it back to Jerusalem. We are not going to use that thing as a lucky charm. If God is going to restore me, then he will restore me to it there. And he sends the priest back with the ark into Jerusalem. You see, David is learning to trust God. But then while he's on his way, a second thing happens. He passes a man in chapter 16, verse 5, named Shamai. Shamai is from the house of Saul. And Shamai doesn't like David very much. In fact, when he passes by him, the text says that Shamai starts throwing rocks at him and is throwing dirt at him. Now, why do you throw dirt at somebody? He's picking up whatever he can find. And this guy's just like, he doesn't like David at all. He's just throwing stuff at him. And while he's throwing stuff at him, the text says in 16 verse 5 that he is cursing him. I mean, the kids are having to cover their ears at this point. And then he says this in chapter 16 verse 7, Get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. To the king. And how did David respond? His guard, who was right next to him, his chief guard, says, I'm going to go chop off his head for speaking like that to the king. And David says, whoa. I've done wrong. My family's a mess. My kingdom is ruined. I've failed and I'm a sinner. And who knows? It could be God who sent him to curse me. And if God didn't send him to curse me, then God can make up for it. Do you know what that is? It's humility. David is learning to take criticism that may be exaggerated, because he says, hey, I don't know the half of it, but I know I'm a sinner. I know I've done wrong. I know I've failed. See, David has come face to face with his own sin, and it softened him. And the other thing that he is doing is he is trusting God. See, in the midst of this tragic story, God is at work. God is at work working his grace into David's life. In the midst of all of our tragic stories, God is at work. He's working his grace into our lives. In fact, that's the place where he usually works most often. In the midst of political unrest, in the midst of family dysfunction, in the midst of the outflow of sin and the brokenness that we've unleashed upon the world, God can take those situations, and he, in the midst of those situations, works his grace into our lives. David is a broken man. And it's in the cracks that God presses his grace. I like to smoke pork shoulder. This is church, so I'll say shoulder. I like to smoke pork shoulder, and one of the things that you do with a pork shoulder to make it taste really good is that you get in all the cracks and all the crevices, and you put Jew in there. You marinate that thing, and then you even break the skin in certain places with a syringe, and you put the marinade in there. You work it deep in there, anywhere you can find. God is marinating David in his grace. And it took breaking him to do so. But it's in that place of brokenness that God can work. Maybe you're broken here today. Maybe you feel broken from life, from your own sin, from the sins of others, from the tragedy of this world. God can work his grace into your life. And here's how you know. Here's how you know if that's happening. You start to come face to face with your own sin and realize, hey, I failed. You stop being so defensive, and you start to trust God for your future. That's what David does. God is at work in David's life in the midst of this tragedy, and God is at work doing something else as well. You see, meanwhile, while David is leaving Jerusalem, Absalom is developing a plan. The plan is being formed at the end of chapter 16, the second half of it, and the beginning of chapter 17. He goes to Ahithophel, and he asks Ahithophel what to do. And then he decides to go to somebody else, this man named Hushai. Now, here's what you need to know about Hushai. One of the things that I didn't tell you is that we meet Hushai when David is actually descending on the mountain. And David sends Hushai back to Jerusalem. Hushai is a double agent. See, David has Hushai there as a double agent. He's also got priests there as spies. You say, priests as spies? I know. It's a compelling story, isn't it? And what else are we going to do? Fight? I mean, come on. So, he's got priests as spies. He's got Hushai back there as a double agent. And Absalom goes and says, okay, I've heard from Ahithophel. Now I'm going to hear from Hushai. Ahithophel gives him a plan. The plan is clean. It is simple. It is decisive. It is swift. It will work. It is practical. Hushai gives him a plan that is convoluted, that's going to take a lot of time, that is not very practical. And you know who Absalom sides with? Hushai. You know what Ahithophel does? He goes to his house. And the text says, verse 23 of chapter 17, he hung himself. You know, sometimes when you get really good at something, the best at your craft, you don't really know who you are without it. Ahithophel was the best of the best when it came to strategy and counseling, and his counsel was rejected, and he didn't know who he was anymore. It is a tragic thing when you don't know who you are without your craft. Some of you are some of the best in the world at what you do, at your fields. That's why you came here. I hope you know who you are beyond your field, beyond your work, beyond what you do. Because it is a tragic thing when you don't. Ahithophel did not. Absalom sides with Hushai, but still the question is, why would he side with Hushai over Ahithophel? We know the text tells us, chapter 17, verse 14, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. And then it says this, for the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. Now this writer, he has not mentioned the Lord at all during this. God has been silent and he has not been active. And yet here he takes a moment to pause to say, God was up to something. It is from a human perspective, a godless narrative with godless events. It is just tragedy everywhere. It's like one of Cormac McCarthy's novels. And yet, the author, the narrator of 2 Samuel whispers to us, in the midst of the tragedy, in the midst of the despair, God may be hidden, but he is not absent. And he is slowly and silently working out his good purposes, the purposes of his covenant for his people and for the world. The Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel. I don't know what you're facing right now, but I hope you know this. I hope you know that in the tragedy of political unrest and the tragedy of family dysfunction and whatever tragedy you're facing, and in the midst of all the noise, that God is still at work, working out his purposes for his glory and for your good. And you may not be able to see it. David couldn't see it. Who would have known? Who would have thought? But God was doing it. In chapter 18, the battle commences. And we hear that the losses were great. Chapter 18, verse 7. The losses, one of the reasons why the losses were so great was not because people were killing each other by the sword, but because the terrain was so rough. The wood was very thick. And we find that Absalom is riding through the wood. And in verse 9, we read that his hair got caught in a branch. The mule that he is riding keeps going, and he is there left suspended between heaven and earth. Just hanging there. Now here's what you need to know about Absalom. He had hair like Fabio. That's what we find. And back in chapter 14, verse 26, it says that when he cut the head of his hair, and he only did it once a year, he weighed the hair of his head 200 shekels by the king's weight. Now listen, if you only cut your hair once a year, and when you do it, you weigh it, guess what? You think you've got some pretty hot stuff there. You like your hair, right? I wish I could do that. I wish I had hair like that. That ended in my 20s. Some of you can still do that. Absalom gloried in his hair. And that which he gloried in became his downfall. It's his hair. And he is caught by his hair. In chapter 18, verse 5, David had said to protect Absalom and to show him compassion. But you know, Joab, he was not a compassionate man. In fact, somebody gave Joab some advice one time. It was back in chapter 11. He said, hey, Joab, don't let losses in war bother you. The sword devours one and then the other. And Joab, he took that advice that David gave him to heart. Butterfly effect. And so Joab took 3 javelins and he stabbed it into Absalom's heart. verse 14. In chapter 18, verse 24, the messengers come to tell David the word. When one finally reaches him in verse 31, he says, "Good news for my Lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." And David asked, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Verse 32, the man responds, in essence, he's dead. And may it be like that to all the people who rise up against the king. And David, when he heard the news that they had won the war, he did not rejoice. He did not sing. He wept. Verse 33, it says that he was deeply moved. He went up to his chamber over the gate and he just wept. And it wasn't only David that wept, but all the men of Israel, chapter 19, verse 2, wept with him. So the victory of that day was turned into mourning for all the people. You know, in this fallen world, some victories feel like losses. Because in this fallen world, there are tragedies. Life is tragic, and this victory was a loss. And yet, in the midst of this tragedy, God was still at work. You see, after the dust settles, Shamai, he comes back, he appears again. He realizes, whoa, I hitched my trailer to the wrong wagon. And so he comes to David in chapter 19, verse 19, and he says, "Let not my Lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my Lord the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart, for that your servant knows that I have sinned." Do you know what David said to him? Well, his guard said, "Let me kill him again." And David said, verse 22, "You shall not die." And he gave him an oath. Do you know those are the exact words that Nathan said to David? It's the exact exchange. David said, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said, "You shall not die." And now Shamai comes and he says, "I sinned against the king." And David says to him, "You shall not die." You see, what happens is now David has received grace. Before he'd been offered grace, but now he's received grace. He's taken it into his life, and it's actually been a power that's working in him and transforming him so that it works through him, and he extends that grace to others. The exact grace that God showed him is now working through his life, being extended to Shamai. God is working his grace into David. And he works his grace into me and to you as well, so that we can receive that grace and we can live out of that grace and extend it to others. Because it's one thing to be offered it, it's one thing to be told about it, but when you take grace into your life, when you receive the gift works. It lives. It's a power. It has a butterfly effect as well. And when did God do this? In the midst of tragedy. This story, I believe, is a story about tragedy and a story about grace. And the most poignant moment that brings those two ideas together is in chapter 18, verse 33. When David hears the news, he says, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Now those words are tragic. "Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And those words are full of grace. I would have died in your place. You know, centuries later, those two concepts would come together again. One of David's greater sons. Jesus Christ would come and he would ascend the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. And he would go outside of Jerusalem, and there curses would be flung at him. And there, he would die. Instead of rebellious sons and daughters. You see, there we would learn more poignantly than we do in 2 Samuel that God is working out his covenant purposes despite the tragedy of our sin. And there we would learn in a way that we will never, ever, ever, ever get over. That God will not take away life. And he devises a means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. There he died for rebellious sons and daughters who tried to take the kingdom away from him. And he made us his heirs. And he brought us back into the family and has brought us to his table. And so, wayward son or daughter, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, come home. Come home. Amen.